Our thought for today is, now that St. Patrick's Day, March 17th is over, you can now resume your normal nationality. We'll see you on May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, when we'll all be Mexican. Today we have this powerful story from John chapter 5, the curing of the paralyzed man by the pool of Bethesda, and it says it occurred on the feast of the Jews, because all Jewish males over the age of 13 every year had to go to Jerusalem for 3 feast days: the feast day of Passover, the feast day of Pentecost, and the feast day of Tabernacles. We don't know which feast day it was, but we do know that the Lord went up to Jerusalem with the disciples, and John says, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool. That's a very fascinating sentence because it's speaking in the present tense. Many scholars have always thought that John's gospel was written in 90 or 100 AD, right before the death of John. But this seems to be some of the internal evidence that John's gospel might have been written earlier than that, before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Because after 70 AD, this whole area was destroyed. And yet John is saying there is in Jerusalem this sheep gate and the pool. Now the recent excavations, actually about 100 years ago, in 1888, these pools were discovered by the archaeologists. They are right on the outskirts of the city of Jerusalem, because the sheep gate was where the livestock, the cattle, the sheep will be brought in from the fields. They would have to be washed in that region before they were led up to the temple to be sacrificed. And they did discover these 5 colonnades, which represented the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. So that's why there were 5 colonnades in that area. Now this area called Bethesda, or sometimes Bethsaida, means the house of flowing water. Beth means house, Bethsaida means the house of flowing water. And it was like a Lourdes or Fatima. It was a place where the blind, the lame, the paralyzed would go. And because it seemed that there were miraculous healings that would occur in the water. And just as people go today to be healed and cured. In fact, the Romans, even after they would rebuild this area, would build a hospital on this site because it was known for healings and cures. One of the ancient manuscripts talks about they waited for the movement of the waters. When the waters were stirred up or troubled, then it says people, the first one to go into the water at that time would be healed. The tradition, according to St. Jerome and others, is that an angel would go down once in a while and stir up the waters, and whoever was there would be healed. Well, the Lord sees this man lying by this pool. It's actually also interesting, if you go to New York City, go to Central Park. In the middle of Central Park is a pond which has the statue of the angel. And this is to pay homage to this pool of Bethesda, so next time you go to New York City and go to Central Park, check out that angel overlooking this pond. So then the Lord sees he has been sick for a long time, paralyzed for a long time. In fact, we find out it's 38 years. So in some respects, he represents the chosen people who for 38 years journeyed in the desert looking for the promised land. And the Lord asked him a really strange question. Do you want to be healed? Do you want to be healed? Obviously, he's there for 38 years. And some people become very complacent. They become comfortable in their state in life, or maybe he was doing okay, receiving handouts, receiving coins, receiving scraps of food. Maybe he became comfortable in his condition, and of course he begins to give excuses. I have nobody to help me into the pool when the water is stirred up. So the Lord has compassion upon him. We see this human compassion of the Lord's most sacred heart. But we also see his divinity, because he says, rise, take up your mat and walk. So at the words of Christ, the man is immediately healed. So we have here this instantaneous cure. It says at once the man was cured, picked up his mat and walked. Of course, this was on the Sabbath, a Saturday. And even though The Old Testament did not prohibit carrying a mat on the Sabbath because that was not considered work. The scribes and the Pharisees did consider it breaking the Sabbath. This was one of their additional laws that they had added. Even though it did not break an Old Testament law, it broke one of their 39 rules of the tradition of the elders. So this man goes to the temple, perhaps to thank God for his cure. And they said, "Who told you, why are you carrying the mat?" And he did not want to take responsibility, so he blamed Jesus. He said, "Well, this man told me to carry my mat." But Jesus had slipped away in the crowd. And it's interesting now that the gospel ends with the Lord finding him in the temple again and warning him, "Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse will happen to you." Very interesting statement. And of course, what does this mean? Well, we don't know what kind of sins this paralyzed man had committed during his life, perhaps sins of envy or lust or jealousy or greed. We don't know what his sins were, but the Lord healed him and told him not to sin anymore, so that something worse might not happen to him. Well, what could be worse than being paralyzed for 38 years? Of course, it is going to hell for all eternity. That is far worse. Illness and disease is not the worst thing in life. The worst thing in life is sin, which leads people to hell. That is the greatest, and really the only tragedy in life, is separation from God. So we have this powerful story, and again, the fathers of the church see the waters of Bethesda as a representation of baptism, that the people would go to the pool of water to be healed of physical ailments, but we go to the waters of baptism to have our sins washed away.